Robert, welcome to the Positive Leadership Academy podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes, I'm going to dive into it because your topic is very, I resonate a lot with what you talk about. But you often say that violence is not random. Can you walk us through what you mean by that and what is the pathway to violence that most people miss?
Sure thing. So, one of the weird sort of paradoxical narratives, that sort of dichotomy that we've sort of experienced, is that after these attacks, we often hear, this was a horrible random act of violence. And what that does is that sort of pigeonholes us into a framing that this was unforeseen, that this was just sort of popped out of nowhere and there was nothing that we can do about it. And then about 5 minutes later in that press conference, or 10 minutes later, you start hearing more and more about the perpetrator of that attack. And you begin to sort of hear this character arc story of behavioral problems early on in school, or behavioral problems at work, maybe some run-ins with mental and social help sort of programs and services, maybe some run-ins with the police from time to time. And that sort of runs counter to this idea of random, right? And so I think for the general public, there becomes this weird sort of psychological toss-up, sort of juggling act that's being done with, like, well, if it's random, then I want more protection and I want more preparedness and response measures, right? Because if you don't know what, when, or where it's going to come from, then yeah, by all means, put as many layers of protection in between me and everything else. And so you get those sort of fences, and you get the bulletproof glass, and you get the cameras, and you get the more upfront security personnel and things like that into an environment, or you get more active shooter drills and things like that from a preparedness side.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have this other side that's sort of like, no, we had a long history of touch points with this individual, and we saw escalations of behavior and things like that. And that doesn't, well, if that's the case, then we needed to do something on the prevention side of things, right? Like what was it that, how did this person slip through the cracks and everything else? And so when you start really delving into the psychology of these individuals that commit these attacks, you begin to realize that there really is no profile per se, that irregardless of the motivation of the individual, that they follow certain steps. They have a grievance that becomes an ideation, and they become more and more radicalized. They begin to move and migrate into more research, whether that's going online and researching more things, or they research a site or a certain particular day when they know that their potential targets are going to be congregating. They'll do some prep work where they will prep either themselves, they'll either acquire weapons, or they'll get more fluent in weapons that they have. They may begin to do more site specific stuff. So they're prepping and seeing, they're testing the waters to see what response times and all that technical stuff, right? Or they may be doing some very interesting behavioral things that are a little abnormal. We've seen a few instances of people moving money around so that their family members or people that they know won't have to deal with certain things, or they'll write a lasting will and all that. Or prepping is
They're
also
kind
like
of like preparing themselves to,
exactly.
yeah, they're
Exactly.
kind of like staging what they're about to do.
Exactly. And then sort of into your staging part, right before the attack, there's usually like a one big giant breach, right? Or a broadcast. And so that's when you sort of see those social media posts with them with guns, or a very cryptic message that says tomorrow's the day, or something like that. The odd thing about the breaching is that it actually goes through that whole process, right? And that there are breadcrumbs, almost like Hansel and Gretel, that they are leaving behind for people to sort of see. The problem is that the people who are collecting these breadcrumbs don't actually have a holistic view of what's going on. They have something within the context of their environment or their interactions with that person in that singular moment. So you go to law enforcement and, this individual may have interacted with them, but they weren't doing anything illegal, right? And so law enforcement really doesn't have a lot of resources available to somebody who's
Yeah.
not doing something illegal. mental health may have interacted with this individual, but like, are they a
They're
threat to
fine.
themselves or others? Well, no, not yet. Well, you're going to have to get in the back of the line then, because I've got a stack of people who actually are, and I've only got a limited amount of clinicians. And then school and work and things like that, they usually will have either suspensions or expulsions, or they'll try to keep it in house, right? So they think that they can try to manage this individual in house, and especially when they're going from grade to grade to grade, certain behavioral problems may manifest themselves in one grade, not necessarily in another, than it does in another, and so it's very spotty, right? And so they kind of keep things in house. So what you get is just these slivers, right? And none of them are really sort of combining and coordinating appropriately. And we have grown up in a post 9/11 sort of generation of the whole see something, say something campaign, right? And that's a fantastic, wonderful marketing campaign, because it doesn't really tell you a lot. See something, see what? It doesn't tell you, but we all kind of intuitively know what we're supposed to be looking for. Say something, say to who, say what, right? Like, but we all kind of know. You'll hear a lot from law enforcement or from mental health and stuff like that. We need more reporting, right? We just need more reporting, and then we would be able to do these things. My contention with that is that you don't get this character arc without people sort of acknowledging the fact or saying something, right? We don't necessarily have a reporting problem. What we have is a coordination problem
Yeah.
where.
And that's why you work with individuals from, instead of from the top down, more from the bottom up, right?
Correct. Well, it's actually a two-pronged approach, right? So you have to have the top down, sort of the 30,000-foot view would be getting all of these different sectors to sort of understand what the main objective of prevention is, right? And then taking their expertise, their resources, and what they have available, the information that they have available, and being able within a methodology concept to start sharing that information while keeping sort of aware of civil liberties and civil rights and everything else. But being able to sort of have a philosophical apparatus where these dots get connected, where you can begin to sort of see not necessarily threatening behavior, and I'm sure we'll talk about behavioral threat assessment later on in this, but more of concerning behavior, struggling behavior, right? And being able to be more proactive on that front, because it's really, when you look at these individuals, it's a series of sort of a death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? It just continues to build on itself. That building ends up having a magnification sort of effect where other bad things begin to sort of come at that individual, and they just really can't manage it. And so they sort of fall into this radicalization trap for a variety of different reasons, and they're sort of off to the races. And then, because everybody is only dealing with little slivers of information, they don't necessarily see the urgency of being proactive.
Yeah. You develop or produce a three-part series exploring, the identity, the purpose, and the community as the root element, right? Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. So every human being on earth really looks for three things. And I used in those videos sort of this metaphorical sort of analogy of buckets, right? We're all trying to fill these buckets. And that's identity, purpose, and community, as you mentioned. Because the human brain finds it completely unacceptable for it not to know who it is or where it belongs. And so that abhorrence and that gray area of being sort of adrift is just something that we can't live with. So we have to go and search for it. And certain things will come into our lives, and we'll get different. If we're going to stick with this sort of analogy, where the flow rates will kind of dip, and they'll go a little, they'll wane out, and then something else will come into it and everything else. But for the most part, we look for things that will feed those buckets or reconfirm what's already in those buckets. When you get these sort of shocks to the system, whether it be a certain life event or certain things begin to pile up and things like that, it shakes that sort of foundation, right? And that can be something like as benign as a move. It can be something like a retirement. It can be something as harsh as being fired or kicked out of your apartment, or a divorce or something like that, right? You get these shocks to the system and you don't necessarily know, like, what you are, who you are, where you sort of belong anymore. And so you begin to search it. And what we begin to sort of see is people latching on to these sort of more radicalized things. Now, radicalized things can be things that are good. Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, does the same thing where you go to a meeting, you say, "Hi, my name is Rob. I'm an alcoholic." Boom, there's your identity. What's your purpose? Obviously, to get clean. Who's your community? The community is all the people in this room who also have a shared purpose and a shared identity. And now I have a home, right? And now I'm locked in, right? Or it could be something political or conspiratorial or religious or something, right? Or it could be a combination of the two. What we often do is we try to push back on the what, right? What are they attached to that we may have our own biases against? And
Mm.
so we will push against that what. We don't realize that many times these people are not necessarily connecting to the what, they are connecting to those three intangibles of identity, purpose, and community, right? And so that, whatever that is, even if they do not agree with it 100%, or they are not really fully in on it, they are getting those things that nothing else in their life is providing for them. And so they are almost powerless to jump off that sort of pathway, right? And so it becomes a more psychological and emotional sort of addiction rather than sort of a chemical addiction.
Yeah. I have a question for you. You mentioned about kind of like 3 or 4 concrete signs to look for in individuals like that. What are those warning signs? And now that you sharing all this really good information, I also see in the corporate world, I have seen leaders where they show some type of anger or disruption and like a very abnormal behavior, either, violent language or the way they do things. And it's interesting how people say, well, maybe you burn out, maybe you're stressed, maybe this, maybe that. But like you say, a lot of the corporate world kind of ignore that. And then eventually kind of leads to more and more and more and more and more. And then suddenly they are either hitting an employee or
Yeah.
they're going to work with a gun and they start shooting, um, you know,
So
uh,
I think you've made some really good points there. Like, first off, you sort of very adeptly, sort of reconfirmed my idea of, like, no violence is random, right? Like, people have begun to see this sort of piling up and this types of behavior that were becoming more aggressive and everything else. So it was known, they just don't really know what to do. So one of the clearest sign that many people who commit these types of attacks will demonstrate is isolation. They will begin to sort of peel away from society and
society.
from their families, their friends, and things like that. Again, this goes back to sort of that identity, purpose, and community. They have found something that provides that for them, whatever it was. And so they will begin to sort of retreat into getting basically all of those things from this other path that they are going. So that's one of the big things. That often goes sort of very under the radar. I speak to a lot of schools and things like that, and I'll ask them, "Hey, listen, you tell me the difference between the quiet kid in the corner who
Mhm.
doesn't really cause any problems and the quiet kid in the corner who's not causing problems but is basically in this death grip of isolation, right? Doesn't talk to anybody, doesn't really have any friends, doesn't, right? So that, because it's not really in their face, they seem to sort of dismiss it until those sort of pop off instances begin to happen. And this is something that really mirrors also suicidal ideation. A lot of people that commit these types of violent attacks and this violent ideation also share a lot of similarities with suicidal ideation. They may expect that they're not going to come back, or they expect to be sort of in a shootout with police or something like that. But with people with suicidal ideation, they will often drop hints. And this goes back to sort of like the broadcasting, right? They want to test the waters to see who's going to come to their aid. right? And we have a lot of empathy for people who are suffering from substance abuse or depression and things like that. We do not have that same empathetic approach to people who are sort of doing aggressive behaviors or popping off and things like that. We tend to sort of do what I just said. We tend to isolate them, right? We tend to push them away. That's not something I want. So those types of little pop offs should be very, very telling as well. And if you begin to see escalation of the pop off, maybe they were just having a bad day and there's an act of contrition or something like
Mhm.
that. If it becomes more of a pattern, right? You're seeing them becoming more withdrawn. And then when you're interacting with them, they're just popping off and they're becoming more and more aggressive and everything else. This is a sign, much like that suicidal ideation. These are those breadcrumbs, right? These are the crumbs that we're sort of supposed to see. They are trying to shout out help. Okay. They are doing a very bad job of it. But what they are doing is demonstrating their struggle that they are having within their life, right? And it's manifesting itself into aggressive and violent behavior. When in the same way that if you dropped a line, if you were depressed, that you were thinking of, well, what would it be like if to jump off that roof or something like that, and nobody comes to your aid? Many times people with suicidal ideation will ramp it up, right? They'll draw a picture right? And so you do see this sort of progression, right? Through the pathway of they're becoming more aggressive. They're becoming more erratic. They're doing more things that look more threatening, right? Because nobody is coming with that right type of interruption. They're not asking them if they need help. What can we do to help? They're just pushing them away, which is a natural response, right? It's just a misinterpretation of what's happening. And so oftentimes what you sort of see are these people who have become sort of emotionally and psychologically addicted to this thing. They're headed down this pathway. They're acting more erratic because they can't get off this pathway, and they're asking for help in sort of all the wrong ways. And they're looking for somebody to provide them with a landing area. We've had a lot of attackers who, in their manifestos and journal entries and things like that, have admitted, contrition, right? I'm sorry for the pain that this is going to cause the family.
Yeah.
I'm sorry for the pain that this is going to cause my own family, right? And that doesn't run with the logic, right? From an outside point of view. If you knew what you were doing was going to cause so much pain, like why didn't you just jump off? And this is where sort of intervention and interruption sort of get
Uh-huh.
interchanged. And the reason why they don't get off that pathway is for the same reasons why they got on the pathway. They have not been provided another identity, another purpose, and another community to go to. Like I said,
Sure.
it is
Yes.
unacceptable for the human brain to not have those things, right?
Yeah,
So the
absolutely.
idea to just jump off cold turkey, right? And to start over again is just not going to work. So what you have to do, and this is where the difference between intervention and interruption is, intervention has a top-down power dynamic, right? So that works with somebody with substance abuse. Okay, you are unable to take care of yourself and you are unable to get on a better pathway. So we are going to take our control, we're going to control you and we're going to move you over there. That works for that kind of stuff. If you try that, as I mentioned earlier, we usually throw ourselves up against the what, right? We have our own biases and things like that. If you come over the top with a power dynamic that says, hey, what you are doing is unacceptable, we don't like it, and we are going to take control of it, that doesn't become an intervention, that becomes a power struggle. Okay. And that oftentimes leads to the opposite of what you want. What they will feel is that they are being personally attacked because they are getting a sense of identity. They have a community that you are degrading or denigrating, and they have a purpose that you are saying is unacceptable in society. That's a personal attack to me. I'm going to dig in my heels and I'm going to go even farther down. Then, so by doing an interruption, you are providing those other intangibles that they are looking for. And if we use that sort of bucket and water in the bucket sort of analogy, it needs to be at the same level or greater, right? You can't just sort of offer it as a suggestion, you have to actually sort of make them see that there is a safe landing spot for them to go, that they are going to be able to get the same flow of that identity, purpose, and community as they were with this other thing. And so it makes that shift a lot easier. So that's more of an interruption, intercession, negotiation. Those are the types of things that you mentally, if you are trying to get somebody sort of off this pathway, you want to have that more approach to it.
But yeah. So obviously you mentioned schools. You work with schools. You work with workplaces, nonprofits. First responders. What is one lesson about obviously collaborating across all these different worlds? Right. You talk about. I think sometimes each we can call it worlds. Kind of they work in silos, right? And I think sometimes when these situations happen, they don't have that collaboration between them, right? And I'm not blaming them because these things are happening, but what is one lesson that you have learned and how you help them kind of collaborate more?
So what we have designed is a system of care.
Mm,
And within that system, we have very highly specialized sort of programs or institutions that sort of are in that system. And systems, as I'm sure you sort of in your experience know, systems can be extremely rigid, right? They do not offer a lot of wiggle room.
hmm
Networks, so cross system networks, are often very flimsy. They usually have single points of failure. Somebody gets a new job, somebody retires, a new priority comes up, and the whole network just sort of falls away, right? The system is not necessarily designed for collaboration. And so I have worked with a lot of state agencies on trying to create this sort of concept of care, this more proactive prevention methodology and philosophy in it. And in sort of working with these states, you will find, say, for example, the program that offers food assistance, right? They have analytics that can tell you that if you're a first time recipient of food assistance, 2 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days, you will come for housing assistance,
hmm
right? They are not, food people are not, don't have the systematic approach of talking to the housing people, right? Because they are hyper specialized in just sort of addressing one risk factor or one sort of pitfall within society, right? And so it really places the onus on the person in crisis to navigate their own crises, right? On top of that, all of those hyper sort of specialized systems that we have operate on a threshold methodology where something has to be triggered in order
Better
for them
to
to
respond.
respond, right? And so within that, you are almost designed to not be proactive. You are designed to be reactive. And
Mm,
you have put the responsibility on the person in crisis who is just trying to get food on the table, right? And doesn't know that in 2 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days, they're going to have a housing crisis, right? You could have been far more proactive on that if you knew even a small percentage of the people, let's just say in your state, were going to fall into that trap of being there, getting them in the system, having this concept of care where you are wrapping services around that individual rather than letting them trip over this sort of tripwire that then classifies them for some type of reactive response. All right, which might be too late and everything else. And as we know, you are not just being bombarded by one issue or one grievance, right? You don't just happen to get kicked out of your apartment or your house if you don't have a multitude of other things that are happening that are contributing to that issue, right?
mhm,
And so to really hyper specialize everything to try to find a certain amount of the population that we are going to try to help, but they have to hit this threshold and then we will get to them, sort of thing, creates this very defensive, reactionary type of system that we have. And
mhm,
so, really trying to keep that specialization, but being able to have a understanding of what are we trying to do on the end part of it, and then
Mm.
sort of work backwards, right? Like there is a person that looks to be struggling. Okay, then what? Obviously, we don't want targeted violence and terrorism to happen. Therefore, what has to be true, right? And what has to be true is that we need to sort of even out our security balance. So, as I mentioned earlier, when you say random act of violence, you move to a protection type modality. You move to a response methodology, and you sort of devalue prevention, or you don't devalue it, you just overvalue the protection and the preparedness and response sort of methods. So to try and get your security far more balanced and have much more of a preventative sort of methodology where you're being proactive, you're hitting things before they begin to snowball, actually makes your whole security apparatus a lot better.
Yeah. Okay. For the leaders, they're listening to our podcast, and they are obviously responsible for safety and of their teams or community. What is the single most important step they can take towards prevention, first culture of their workplace?
So
What
I
would
would
you
say
recommend to them?
really focus in on the culture. Really
Yeah.
try to focus in on the narrative that you have within your space. Okay. What I see a lot, especially within the security field, or leaders who have a security element that, but it's not necessarily their expertise, right? They're in charge of
Yeah.
making a space safe, but they are not the security experts. Oftentimes what you will see is are those counter narratives. What you think you are projecting is not what is being interpreted. And I have a great example of this. So it happened personally to me. I was going to a liquor store to get something, and as I'm approaching the liquor store, I see the CCTV camera on the outside, and there's bars on the windows, and there's a huge
Hmm.
fluorescent light
Yeah.
over the door. The door is reinforced, and then there's an alarm that goes off, and then I have to go through this in this holding pen where there's a metal detector. Then I get wanded by a security guard who's also armed. Then I finally enter into what I assume is the actual store. It's floor to ceiling bulletproof glass. I can see the TV cameras, or the TVs with the cameras and me on it. And all of my commerce has to be done through a drawer, right? And talking through it. And I remember thinking in that moment, like, this is such a weird dynamic because I'm in the probably the most safest place I've ever been in my life. And yet I've never been more scared because the narrative wasn't, oh, look at all these security measures. This must be a safe place. It was, what the hell goes on here that they
Yeah.
felt the need to
It's
put
like them
all,
preventing themselves, but the
yeah,
people outside, yes.
why, if you feel the need to put all of this into a liquor store, what goes on in this liquor store? Like,
Yeah.
get me out of here.
Yeah.
Right. And I
I want to
think,
be inside with you to buy
yeah,
my stuff. Yeah.
and I think you do see that a lot with the different sectors where they begin to sort of think that, again, that overvaluation or misinterpreting of valuation. If you're going to spend 200 on security, what is the metric that you are using that evaluates that security and gives you that ROI, right? The idea that you are going to put up this fence or you are going to put more security personnel into an environment, the metric can't be, well, something didn't happen today, therefore it's working, right? And I think a lot of what you see based upon that experience within the liquor store, but you see it in other realms too, whether it's a school campus or it's an office building. There's You change your behavior based upon what you feel, not necessarily what you think. In fact, the way our behaviors actually are most influenced is through feelings, not through thoughts. Thoughts come after the behavior, and then we sort of post
Exactly.
rationalize our behaviors to fit what our opinions and thoughts
Yeah.
about what happened. And so when you see all this personnel, or you see these sort of, large security apparatuses and things like that, it's not always a one for one. People don't always feel like, good, I feel safe. Sometimes they feel more threatened. And I've come up with this sort of idea called, I've sort of labeled it poorly, but I think it works, is sort of like Zen security.
Mm,
And I've created this like haiku of like, as a security professional or as a leader that's in charge of keeping people safe, what you want to do with the environment, whether that's the culture or just the way things are, is you want to make that water as still as possible.
mm,
And that way it's a lot easier to figure out what's causing the ripple. Okay. And so the more noise you put into an environment, there's too many ripples. And you will often missee or you will ignore those little ripples, and you will focus more on what's loud and right in front of your face. And you become
exactly.
reactionary, right? You can't be proactive because you're constantly reacting to the bigger things. And people within that environment might be giving you sort of, because they don't feel safe, their behavior might be somewhat triggering, or it might be something you might get a false positive,
Yeah, you
right?
get
Because they're
confused. Yeah.
just so taken aback by how it is. You can see this sometimes if you go to like international airports and they actually have like armed, what looks like army, military personnel at the airport. It's just something from an American, you're just kind of, you don't typically sort of see that kind of level of security. And so it takes you aback, and you begin to sort of, hulk down, and you're looking back and forth. And to the untrained eye, that you may be, looking quite suspicious, but you're actually just scared. And so it's really important for leaders to sort of understand that not everything that you you're putting out there is perceived in the sort of the same way.
The same way. Yeah. Exactly. It's amazing stuff. And I think community leaders, everyone should be aware of. Where can people find you?
So we have a website, TVTP Solutions. Now, that TVTP is an acronym within sort of the security world for Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention. So TVTP Solutions, there's a contact page there. And then we also have interviews like this one, and we'll be up there. And then we have, as you mentioned, I did like some educational videos as well for people to sort of get a better sense of deep diving into this philosophy of being proactive prevention and things like that. But through the contact page, you can contact me and we can do trainings, we can do consultations. The only thing that we don't do is that we don't do actual casework. So if you have somebody that is sort of, you're worried about or concerned, please go
Yeah.
to the appropriate authorities. We don't have that sort of clinical expertise to sort of take on that casework. But in terms of creating an environment, creating that more prevention philosophy within your town or your school or your office, we can help with that. And we will gladly have a conversation with anybody who wants to talk with us.
Right. And I will put those on the show notes. Well, thank you so much, Robert, for being part of the Positive Leadership Academy podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.